Colleagues, could I invite you to help me welcome our next presenter? He is Mr. Michael Johnston. He is a Charles A. Dana Professor of Political Science, Emeritus from Colgate University. He is an independent scholar, lecturer, and consultant. He is a member of the International AntiCorruption Academy, IACA, frequent visiting faculty. Professor Johnston is a pioneer in the anti-corruption field. He's a PhD Yale University graduate from 1977, and he started his research on corruption in the 1970s and has been teaching at the Academy in the Master in Anti-Corruption Study program since its inception. He has been a consultant to many international organizations and development agencies. His book, Syndromes of Corruption, Wealth, Power, and Democracy, published by Cambridge University Press in 2005, won the 2009 Grimer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. This award was presented by the University of Louisville. Some of Professor Johnston's publications are The Compliance Equation, Making Transparency Real, Accounting and Popular Participation in Corruption Control, and Corruption Contention Reform, The Power of Deep Democratization, published by Cambridge in 2014. Some other of his works: Sad but Timely News from Austin, The Next Time You Hear People Complain, Refugees and Immigrants, Business Leaders for Presidents, No Thanks. I invite you to welcome Professor Johnston. He and Betsy Johnston, his wife, live in Earlville, New York. And I invite Professor Johnston to speak on corruption as a political problem. Over to you, Professor.
There, I think I have unmuted myself, and good morning. We are now based in with you. Greetings from Austin, Texas, where we are now based, and I'm delighted to join you. And I was very happy to see the title of the session about corruption as a political problem, because I think that is the essence of what we face and have faced for a long time. And perhaps surprisingly is a theme in reform that we really haven't given proper emphasis. And so I'm going to offer a few of my own views on this issue, and look forward to any reactions, especially if you wish to get in touch with me by email. My address will be on the final slide, and I'm hoping that perhaps this presentation could start some good conversations going forward. So let me see here about sharing my screen, which, all right, show screen, and try this, and that. And now, can you see the slideshow?
Yes, we're seeing it. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Corruption as a political problem was a very welcome theme, as I've mentioned. And just begin with a few general thoughts. Not so long ago, in the greater scheme of things, I'm talking here as recently as the late 1980s, 1990s, corruption was not seen as a particularly important issue. Let's see, yes, my camera's on. In academia, corruption was not particularly regarded as worthy of study, at least certainly not in the United States. I begin my latest book with a little anecdote about a proposal I sent in the late 80s for a panel for the American Political Science Association, and the letter that I got back says, in effect, "Dear Professor Johnston, thanks for your proposal. However, corruption is not a serious issue, so we will not put you on the program." I don't think that would happen anymore, and that is at least a sign of some progress. In international policy, corruption was a topic to be avoided. Now it's a part of every discussion, or most discussions, and in fact, in some ways, we may overemphasize it as an explanatory factor. The argument you frequently hear is country X should tackle corruption and all these other good things will happen. Well, that would be very nice, but corruption is a more complex and deeply rooted political problem than that. We have now made a variety of kinds of progress. We have data, we have resources, we have a track record that could not really have been imagined even just a few years ago. And the small and marginal movement has grown and it's become an industry. There is actually what I would call, and what others do call, an anti-corruption industry, which in some respects is a good thing. We are certainly more numerous and have more resources, and data, and ideas. But like many another industry, reform has acquired its hegemonic aspects, its own power structure, has its own interests to defend. A good political scientist from Sweden by the name of Jesper Johnston and I did a study in which we tried to figure out what the principled do no harm meant to many international aid and development organizations, and the sad result we found was that it tended to mean protecting one's own interests and one's own assets rather than doing no harm to the surrounding society. Too often reformers have fallen back on tactics that are there because they are there because they're there. Approaches that are rigid, that are unresponsive, that are not really adapted to the contexts in which we are working. And so we end up attacking the symptoms of corruption rather than the deeper causes. A biggest problem that I see is that we too often attack corruption as though it were the same thing everywhere, that we can put whole countries on a one-dimensional index and rank them and thus figure out something meaningful, when in fact those corruption scores don't really tell us much about what to do. It just doesn't make sense to me to say that, well, corruption in Denmark is the same thing as corruption in country X, but Denmark just has less of it. I think there are qualitative contrasts that we have to look at, and yet we are using a reform playbook that is still based in and informed by the experiences of large liberal democracies, for the most part, in the North and West. And I think we need to do better than that. The results of all of this have really been unsatisfying. I don't know of anyone who says that we've got corruption on the run around the world. If anything, it seems to be becoming more lucrative and more deeply hidden and entrenched, and even more elusive. Academic research, and I level this at my own field. Academic research often seems to retrace the same circles repeatedly, or we see minuscule case studies that need to be generalized in some comparative way, but are just simply told as freestanding examples. But examples of what? Most worrying of all to me is that reform, for all of our efforts, and these efforts involve a lot of courageous people. I mean, make no mistake, there are people who devoted their lives and put everything on the line to fighting corruption. But too often, the reform industry has done relatively little to help the people who suffer the most, and to get at the political economy of corruption, which is that most corruption hurts the people who can least afford to be hurt, and who are least able to defend themselves. So reform has done relatively little to help the people who suffer the most. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about transparency, talking about good governance and so forth, but as the title suggests, the deepest, most fundamental problem, as I see it, is political. And this is the theme of the recent book that I have out with a good political scientist in Oklahoma named Scott Fritzen. The fundamental problem is the imbalances of power that enable some people to exploit others. And we can have all of the transparency we want, and we can have all of the good governance and all of the efficiency and everything else that people may recommend. But if we don't enable people to resist the exploitation that's being directed at them, if we do not help them defend themselves, their property, their interests, their families, their quality of life, most of our reform ideas are going to come to naught. That sort of political realism is what gave rise to the basic idea of corruption in the first place. I mean, people saying, look, you know, you may be the king, you may be the prince, you may be the president, but you're going to have to stop abusing me and my family and my property and my business. We're going to have to draw some lines. And the idea is a highly political idea, therefore it is a highly conflicted idea. It's one that is not fixed with technical projects, important though they may be. It is one that is not going to be rectified in a 3-year governance improvement project. It's the work, frankly, of generations. It's the work that in my country is completely unfinished, or not completely, but largely unfinished, and that in many other countries is very much a work in progress. So this notion of imbalances of power, corruption as a political problem, I think is absolutely critical. One of the books I did a few years ago, 2014, I begin with the idea you see on the screen, and that is that corruption will continue. In fact, it may well be the norm until those with the stake in ending it are able to oppose it in ways that cannot be ignored. But as he so often did a long time before, and much earlier, Frederick Douglass said it better. Power, said Douglass, concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And our task, as I see it, our task as anti-corruption reformers is substantially to give voice to those demands, to enable people to give voice to their own demands, to make them in unmistakable and sustained kind of ways, and sustain that demand over time. Many of you will know of societies around the world, and in fact, my own country increasingly is one, in which we have all sorts of laws on the books, we have all sorts of regulations available to us, but they're not very well enforced. The demand is that they be enforced is weak and inconsistent, and so putting the improved legislation, improved procedures, improved transparency out on the table is critically important work, but it needs that political foundation under it. It needs that social support and demand to make it stick. And we need to keep Frederick Douglass's wisdom in mind when we engage in something as audacious as trying to challenge the powerful and check corruption. And yet that is a complicated job too, as I'll suggest in a moment. Quite often we talk about corruption control mostly as a public good. We are pursuing better government for everybody. Well, that's a fine idea, but that's like cleaning up the air for everyone or saving the whales for everyone. Too often we're all in favor of that, and too often we're willing to let other people do the heavy lifting. Corruption reform as a public good is vulnerable to collective action problems, free rider problems. Fighting corruption can be time consuming, it can be risky, it can be dangerous, and it's just kind of the process that many people are willing to applaud from the sidelines, But if we all let somebody else take the lead, the job is not going to get done. And in country after country and community after community, we have seen the rise of promising anti-corruption initiatives that over time tend to fade away and just tend to run into the sand, because eventually this support for them weakens and evaporates. Too often in many societies, the ones we all care about the most, change has been for the worse, not necessarily for the better. As unsatisfying as the status quo might be, shaking things up and changing things might be, might be a way of making things worse, or we can imagine why people might fear that it would be. They've seen that kind of change in their lives before, and are perhaps very cautious about it. And one thing we tend to forget is that some people think they stand to benefit from corruption, that even if they're not getting a few crumbs from the table now, that they eventually will do so, that the local leader who is doing a poor job of representing us eventually will come around and give me a job, or will help me out. I was in Peru a few years ago, and there was a phrase that people said, translates into English as he steals, but he brings us projects. Our local councilor or whoever is crooked, but at the same time he fixes the roads, or he builds us a school or something of that sort. Well, all too often those roads don't get fixed and the school doesn't get built. But even if it does, people are losing political opportunities. They are losing the opportunity to have a say in their lives. The long-term costs of those projects, even if they are built, can be formidable. And so we need to stop looking at reform just as something that's a good idea for everybody. Instead, we need to go back a slide. We need to help people, encourage them to assert their own interests, not just better policy and transparency, as major challenges though those are, not just good governance, which is one of those terms that often we're not quite sure what it means, and unfortunately it has the politics drained out of it, but fairness, decent treatment by the police officer on the corner, or by the local prefect, family security, dignity, the opportunity to make a living and to defend one's gains. These are the kinds of things that we need to use to frame reform. We need to show people that reform is real, that instead of saying we're trying to do better governance in some abstract sense, maybe say things like, we're trying to ensure that your water and your electricity are available 24/7. We're trying to ensure that your taxes are fair, that your business will not be abused by some local official. And we need to make those connections, and make those connections clearly and consistently. We need in that way to help build and support resistance to corruption in society, not just reform from the top down, though there's much about that is quite worthy, but reform from the bottom up. Because if you look at historical cases, and there are quite a few of them, there are societies now that are regarded as generally well governed, whose history shows a tremendous amount of corruption in the past. And what happened was a process of really a challenge from the bottom up, a good deal of conflict, a good deal of contention, but people asserted their interests and drew lines and boundaries around what officials could do to them. Now, when I speak of reform from the bottom up, I'm not talking about externally funded civil society projects. Some of them are quite good, some of them are not. Too often, those externally funded civil society projects are short-lived. They are based in and around national capitals. They go to people who are, pulling in grant money on a variety of kinds of issues. Do they really get out into the society, into its natural networks, into its natural leadership? Quite often the answer is no. Instead, we need to be aware, and I think this is where the societies in our organization today, we need to be aware of the kinds of networks and rooted leadership that exist in a society, and build upon them, bring them into the fight, and work with them as partners. The real kinds of networks and leadership that are already there, and that people already turn to in many ways to deal with problems in their lives. That's not a simple process. I mean, sometimes those leaders are compromised. Sometimes those networks are used by others for their own purposes. But better to start working within that sort of geography of leadership than to ignore it or trying to fight against it. Basically, the effort is one to improve citizens' quality of life and have them be involved in that, and in that asserting a set of restraints on government. Now, sometimes people ask me, let's say you have an effort that is improving the provision of schools or improving the provision of public utilities. How do you know how much of that improvement is coming from corruption reduction, and how do you know how much is coming from other kinds of improvements? Well, as a scholar, I care about that issue a lot. As a reformer, though, I really don't care at all. It seems to me that if we are able to help people demand and obtain better performance of government on a sustained basis over the middle to long run, we're doing our job. And as I'll suggest in a moment, we might not even want to talk very much about corruption itself. Now, let me suggest, and I'll try to wrap up here fairly quickly, that your region and your societies are critically important and are fascinating challenges, distinctive challenges, urgent challenges in the terms that I've talked about. Not only because of their location and the strategic importance of the Caribbean as a historic crossroads location for the entire globe, but also many of the societies have a relatively small social scale, but they have diversity and depth, real complexities in depth. The economies are distinctive and in some ways contrasting, and are different economies from those of the North American and West European societies that devise much thinking about reform. The demographic, the historical, the cultural dimensions are all important, are all distinctive, and you all know more about them by far than I do, but again, I want to suggest that your region offers some real opportunities. Mainstream anti-corruption strategies strike me as unlikely to be all that effective in the region. Most of them emerged in very large or middle-sized mass society, liberal democracies. In this region, personal ties, often face-to-face relationships, grassroots networks, family networks, are critical just to understanding what's going on. The distance between leaders and citizens is both much reduced and at the same time open to be exploited at times by corrupt officials. Pardon me. Many people, and I thank Mr. Harrison for making this point in his comments earlier to me, many people will personally know those who are involved in corruption. And, if we're saying, well, let's go out and get the corrupt bad guys, I mean, many people may say, well, well, wait a minute, what you call a bad guy is actually my brother-in-law or something like that. And those are ties that have to be recognized and handled with great sensitivity. Social norms and expectations may matter as much as laws. I mean, we have seen that in terrifically problematical ways in the United States, where we've got the laws on the books, we have agencies to enforce them, and if you have a regime in which the leaders just simply say, "I'm going to do what I want, I don't care about the norms," you can be in major trouble. So those social norms and expectations are going to be tremendously important. And the members of your organization, it seems to me, have real wisdom to build upon and to impart to the rest of the reform movement. A whole set of dimensions and kinds of connections, a degree of access to corruption as people experience it, that the mainstream reform movement often forgets or overlooks or doesn't wish to pay attention to. I mean, I think around the tables this morning and in our scattered locations this morning, I think you've got tremendous wisdom to offer about how to fight corruption from the ground up. And my bottom line on this slide, I hope, is not going to be seen as patronizing. I think it's something that is true I have found so often, and that is that when it comes to corruption fighting, you may well know more than you think you do. Having confidence in the knowledge that you've got about your own societies is a critical first step, rather than listening to everything you're told from New York and Berlin and London. Yes, I mean, let's have that conversation, but let's have it be a multi-direction conversation. And I'm for that reason very much looking forward to your reactions to these thoughts. So just a very few suggestions. First, do no harm. I mean, one thing to remember is reform is disruptive, it is stressful, it often involves conflict. It's entirely possible to do harm in the name of trying to do good. And so, proceeding with caution and recognizing that corruption control isn't an 18-month project on a grant. It is the work of rebuilding a society's basic political relationships over generations. First, do no harm, and then build trust. Show people that reform is real. Show people that reform brings them those public utilities that work, brings them better treatment by the police, brings them better treatment when they go down to the tax office, and so forth. One of the things that I like to propose, and I have some papers I'd be glad to send anyone who's interested, is to monitor and benchmark the quality of services and facilities. Pardon me. Basic things. How long does it take to get a passport or a license? How many inspections do small business people have to deal with? How variable and negotiable are tax assessments? What are the prices that local governments and maybe national governments are paying for basic comparable commodities? Those are ways to spot the hot spots. Those are ways to identify the hot spots for corruption. If you have a licensing project that takes far longer than in one jurisdiction than it does in others, and if it involves 35 steps instead of 4 steps, there's a place to attack. There's something to do, speed up that process within reason. You might not even, especially in smaller societies, want to spend all that much time talking about corruption as such. People know there's corruption. It's no surprise to them. A big sort of national splashy campaign may not be the way to go. Danny Kaufman put it very well when he said, you don't fight corruption by fighting corruption. You fight corruption by enabling people to demand and assert the demand for better kinds of treatment. I mentioned here in the next line the name Julian Daniel from Montserrat. He's a former student of mine at the International Anti-Corruption Academy in Vienna. And he did a wonderful thesis based on Montserrat about what he called stealth reform. And that is going after corruption without necessarily saying that's what you're doing, but improving the quality of services, improving the way people are treated by officials, making people more confident about organizing for themselves, voicing their own needs and interests, and so forth. And corruption, in a certain sense, will take care of itself if that kind of reform is done. And he wrote a brilliant thesis showing how that could apply to very small but still complex societies. If anyone is interested in being put in contact with him, I would be very happy to do that. One thing you can do with benchmarking services and the like is identify and reward those communities and leaders that are making progress. Now, there's a tremendous amount of activity in the anti-corruption industry going into a country, going into a community and saying, well, you've got huge problems here and you're doing a terrible job, ABC. Why not, why not use positive publicity where it's appropriate? Why not reward those who are improving things, even at a slow pace, and reward them with publicity, with support, with prestige, with political backing? None of this means that we neglect transparency, compliance, the current term of art, and that sort of thing. But we need to keep anti-corruption reform focused on citizens' own lives, their own benefits, their own interests. And if we have governments that do a better job in a sustained way of addressing those concerns, we'll be on the right track. I mean, ultimately, the reason why I care about corruption, the reason I suspect why you care about corruption fundamentally is justice. And, if you think of it that way, that puts so much of what the anti-corruption movement does into a somewhat different light. So my sort of final thought is that I think your region can be a very exciting laboratory for reform. Many things that make it distinctive can be seen not only as challenges, but as real opportunities, and opportunities to do and learn things that deserve the attention of the rest of the global movement. The small scale of societies, their diversity in depth, the strong primary ties. I mean, there's a form of accountability there already, and there may be a chance for corruption control to build on that, to show benefits in ways people can see in daily lives, and to show them relatively quickly. And so I look forward to watching those kinds of developments as they unfold in your region, and I hope we can stay in touch, and I look forward to any thoughts and ideas you might want to send my way. So there's my email address there. I would be delighted to hear from anyone, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Excellent presentation, thought-provoking, which is very important. And you diplomatically stayed in the middle, in spite of the topic, corruption as a political problem.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm intrigued too. I'm intrigued, in my words, Professor, that sometimes we speak about a means to an end, or the end in itself. But in terms of a solution-oriented approach, and the notion that any approach to tackle corruption, it should not have this one-size-fits-all approach, because
Right.
you certainly can't transplant what's happening in one place to another, because each country must determine its priorities, and you must determine exactly what is the framework you need. But is there any, based on your experience, is there any particular approach, model that you believe is better placed for the Caribbean, the Americas? We think of Singapore, we think of ICAC in Hong Kong. There are so many different models. Is there any particular model that you would say is more favorable to the Caribbean experience or the Commonwealth experience?
Well, I think the answer depends on the kind of society we're talking about. Hong Kong and Singapore are small authoritarian societies, sadly becoming more so in Hong Kong. Singapore is more socially diverse than Hong Kong, but again, it's a small city state, and they were in a position to choose law enforcement strategies and put them into effect, really in an unchallenged kind of way. But one aspect of Hong Kong that I think is worth talking about is their long-term effort at public education. And here I have to admit, I wonder now what's going to happen in the new sad realities of Hong Kong. But Hong Kong spent 40 years and more educating people about corruption and that there's an alternative to it, and showing that they could file reports of corruption and they could do so safely and would get results. And in the 1970s, when the ICAC was established, opinion polls showed that only about 17 or 18% of the Hong Kong population felt confident in filing corruption reports. By the end of the 1990s, that figure was up in the high 70s or even the low 80s. People had been shown that they could make complaints, do so safely, and get results. That's a long-term process, and it was coupled also with school curricula. It was coupled with social events and social clubs that really built on social solidarity in the neighborhoods to bring people together in anti-corruption activities. And I think it's having that kind of detailed knowledge of a society, of what makes it work, what holds people together, is the essence of that. The answers to that will be different in the United States from what they are in Argentina, and different again from what they are in Jamaica. But knowing something about those kinds of results is critical. 2 points to keep in mind. I think one is that corruption control is never done. It's never finished. Never ended as a challenge. There will always be new corrupt figures, new techniques, new places for them to hide. Think of what they can now do in cyberspace and offshore. And there again, your Caribbean region is particular importance in terms of offshore economies. Another issue to keep in mind: what's the opposite of corruption? What do we want? What do we seek? Zero corruption is not on the cards. We're not going to get there. And as Robert Klitgard pointed out years ago, the costs of doing that at some point might exceed the benefits. But what do we want? And I think that's where we come back to this notion of justice, of people asserting and defending their own interests, and of making reform a task of improving the quality of life on a daily basis. Where has that been done? It's been done over time, and really in a very kind of indirect way in some of the better governed societies. I'm thinking of Canada, I'm thinking of Australia, and so on. And there are others. I mentioned those because they have a sort of a common Commonwealth connection here. But the answers are going to be different from one place to another. So I think my general response, and I probably have said too much on this, but my general response would be the notion of thinking about what's the opposite of corruption and how do we seek it from the bottom up as well as from the top down.
Thank you so very much. The difficult question I ask, but I too try to explore the line of diplomacy, the topic of corruption as a political problem. You spoke about what I would fashion the public education program and what was done in Hong Kong in terms of the school system, but what sort of school system, for want of a better term, do we have for political figures? what type of systems should we put in place for political figures in terms of codes of conduct and in terms of behavior?
I think we have learned in the United States how little we've understood that question, how critical it is. We, I think, tended, if I may speak of the U.S. for a few moments, I think we tended to assume that our Constitution and legal framework would be sufficient, that they, could be put on automatic pilot in effect, and that would be enough to, provide useful guardrails and controls on corruption. Then we, sort of went about our lives and let somebody else do the heavy lifting. The trouble is that we in the United States ignored our responsibilities as citizens. We ignored the importance of our normative frameworks, our shared values, such as they are, and somebody came along with real disregard for that, and we can see what the results have been. I think it's going to be a generation at least before we can repair the damage of the last 4 or 5 years. So part of that education is for citizens to take seriously. In my former university, we put in place a program, as old-fashioned as it sounds, that had a strong component of civics, and people were wondering why we were doing something so uncool, but I think it was worthwhile. Some of the education that goes on has to be from citizens to political leaders, showing what it is we will and will not put up with. And unfortunately, we in the U.S. have too many people who are willing to put up with pretty much anything, so long as it makes the people they dislike unhappy. We need to return to our shared responsibilities as citizens in a democracy, and to understand that it's our values and expectations that matter a great deal, just as much as the laws. Now that sounds like sort of an old school civics lecture, and I suppose in some respects it is, but that too is a long-term process of mutual education, of communicating expectations, and of showing that certain kinds of actions will have certain kinds of consequences in not only public life but in our own lives. And that's a difficult lesson to teach people. I mean, people are far too interested in sitting in front of their screens and playing video games and such. If we say, well, let's do something that's going to involve going to some meetings, I don't think very many people are willing to put up with that. So we have a long way to go.
Thank you so much, Professor. At this time, there are no questions. However, I invite colleagues to look at the last slide, mjohnston@colgate.edu. If you have any questions, or if you wish to source material that Professor Johnston commended to us. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you. Presentation. Colleagues.